She didn't ask for special treatment. She just wanted her seat, her files, and a quiet flight. But the flight attendant looked at her once and decided she didn't belong there. No smile, no meal, no apology when water spilled across her lap. Everyone watched, but no one said a word. She stayed silent too, until one quiet message turned the whole airline upside down. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss a new one. Danica Miles pressed her back gently into the cushioned seat of 3A business class. Her blazer was damp near the collar. Rain had started just as she stepped out of the cab. She had hoped the flight would be uneventful. No small talk, no stares. Just 4 hours of quiet time before landing in D.C. Her court files were stacked neatly in her briefcase, secured under the seat. She pulled out a soft cloth napkin and started drying the edges of her manila folders, careful not to smudge the ink on the topmost sheet. The case tomorrow wasn't just important, it was historic. But Danica never looked the part of someone important. Her clothes were simple, her posture calm, and her face didn't give much away. People usually didn't realize who she was until much later. As passengers filed in, a tall man in a navy overcoat squeezed his bag into the overhead bin above her. The flight attendant, young, with straight blonde hair pulled tight into a bun, hurried over. "Sir, let me help you with that," she said, giving him a wide smile. The man thanked her with a wink. The attendant turned to Danica briefly and nodded without speaking, then moved on. Danica looked down, adjusting her seatbelt. She had seen this before. She wasn't looking for a welcome, just a little balance. A few minutes later, the same attendant passed by with a tray of welcome drinks. She offered champagne to the row ahead, sparkling water to the couple across the aisle, then turned back with a quick glance at Danica's seat and walked on without stopping. No explanation, no eye contact, just skipped. Danica didn't ask why. She never did. But her jaw tightened slightly as she looked at her files again. A small stain had spread over the corner of her argument draft. She folded the sheet carefully and reached into her bag for a dry page. Behind her, someone laughed too loud. The laughter didn't bother her. It was the words that came next. "Some folks bring their whole desk on board. Must be important or just pretending." A voice chuckled. Danica didn't turn around. Her left hand slowly tapped against the leather armrest, keeping time with her breath. In and out. Keep still. Let it pass. That's what she'd done for years. But something about today felt off. She didn't know it yet, but this would not be the flight she sat through quietly. This time something would snap. And it wouldn't be her. The plane began to taxi, the soft hum of the engine masking quiet whispers and the crinkle of newspapers. Danica Miles folded her hands in her lap, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of her seatbelt. Across the aisle, a young couple was snapping selfies with their drinks. The man in front of her was already reclining, sipping from a glass of wine. The blonde flight attendant came down the aisle again, this time holding a small tablet. She leaned over a row ahead, confirming meal preferences with a warm tone. "Mr. Alder, you'll be having the salmon." "Got it. And for Mrs. Alder, vegetarian with a side of sparkling grape." "Perfect." Danica watched, not for long, but long enough to notice something. The care in her voice, the small laugh, the way she crouched a little to speak at eye level. Then she straightened and moved to Danica's row. She stopped beside her, tablet in hand, but didn't look at her right away. She glanced toward the seat behind, then back at Danica without much expression. "I'll need your bag moved under the seat," she said, her tone flat. Danica blinked. "It's legal paperwork. I can't bend it under there. The case file could get damaged." The attendant didn't respond for a moment. Then, with a sigh, she said louder, "All bags need to be stored properly. That includes yours." Her eyes flicked to the passengers nearby. Danica stayed calm. "I understand the rule, but this briefcase holds protected documents. If you need, I can place it in a closet space up front." The attendant, Her name tag read Stacy Colburn, tightened her lips. "That's for priority guests," she said. "You're not on that list." Danica stared at her. A few nearby passengers shifted in their seats. One man coughed. A woman across the aisle looked down at her magazine. Danica slowly opened the side of her briefcase and removed a slim folder. She placed it carefully on her lap. "Then I'll keep it right here. It won't be in the way." Stacy said nothing. Her silence lingered like a judgment. Then, with a small shrug, she walked away. Danica didn't watch her leave. She just closed the flap on her briefcase again and adjusted the folder in her lap. Outside the window, the rain had cleared. The runway lights flickered past in long lines. The plane lifted into the sky. Danica leaned her head slightly to the side, resting against the seat. She was tired, but her eyes stayed open. It was only the beginning of the flight, and something inside her told her the worst hadn't happened yet. The plane settled into the sky, leveling out as the fasten seatbelt sign turned off with a soft ding. Danica Miles sat quietly, her knees together, one hand resting on the folder in her lap, the other lightly curled around the armrest. She stared out the window, but her thoughts were far from the clouds. Her cheek still held the faint warmth from the earlier exchange, not from touch, but from the slow burn of humiliation. It was the tone. The way Stacy Colburn spoke to her like she was a child blocking the aisle, or someone who had wandered into a cabin she didn't belong in. Danica had seen this before, not always in the same form. Sometimes it was a question left unanswered. Sometimes it was a pause too long before someone said her name. Sometimes it was a glance past her in a room she was supposed to lead. Subtle things, but she had built her entire career watching those subtle things, dissecting them, proving them, and forcing the law to speak about what others ignored. She opened her folder and tried to refocus on the notes for tomorrow's hearing. The plaintiff was a black female pilot, fired after speaking up about unequal shift schedules. Danica had taken the case personally. She always did. She was told once, by a judge no less, that she had too much heat in her argument. But how else could you carry decades of quiet harm if not with heat? Still, she had learned over the years to use her heat like a scalpel, not a flame. A tray cart rattled down the aisle, pulling her out of her thoughts. Stacy was returning, her voice soft and cheerful again. She moved row by row, pouring drinks, offering snacks, laughing lightly at things passengers said. Danica watched her work, not out of curiosity, but with careful eyes, measuring, noting, storing. When Stacy reached Danica's row, she didn't look directly at her. She placed a plastic cup of room-temperature water on Danica's tray table and walked away without a word. No choice offered, no options listed, just the water. Danica looked at the cup. Her reflection floated faintly on the surface. It wasn't the lack of champagne or ginger ale. It was the decision to treat her differently without reason and without shame. The man behind her, a younger guy in a golf cap, leaned forward slightly and muttered under his breath, not loud but not private either. "Guess she's not one of their usual types up here." His friend chuckled. Danica turned her face back to the window, not because she didn't hear, but because if she reacted to every whisper, she'd never get anything done. She thought about her mother for a moment, a nurse who once had to work a full shift after a patient called her the N-word, and the hospital told her to take the high road. Her mother had come home that day and washed her hands for a full 10 minutes without saying a word. That memory stayed with Danica more than anything else. She reached slowly into her briefcase again and pulled out her pen, underlining a section in her legal brief. She could feel the stare from across the aisle now. The woman who had been flipping through a fashion magazine was watching her, maybe with curiosity, maybe pity. Danica didn't care which. She folded her folder shut. The drink remained untouched, her cheek still warm with restraint, her pulse steady, but her mind, it was preparing. Not for a fight, but for something more permanent. Because she had a rule, one she had never broken. If they crossed the line, she made sure they never did it again. An hour passed in silence. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft amber, casting long shadows across the seats. Most passengers were watching movies or half asleep under thin blankets. But Danica Miles remained upright, her tray table closed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had read the same paragraph in her case file 3 times without taking in a single word. Her mind kept drifting back again and again to the sound of that voice, Stacy Colburn's voice. Not the words, but the tone. Flat, clipped, dry, like something scraped off a plate. It wasn't just disrespectful. It was familiar. Danica had heard it in boardrooms, in security lines, even in courthouse elevators. It was the voice of someone who already decided who you were before you said anything. That voice didn't ask questions. It made assumptions. Danica closed her eyes, trying to still the thoughts. You're not on that list. That one sentence had stayed with her like a splinter, not just because of what it said, but how it was delivered, in front of other people, loud enough to be heard. She hadn't wanted attention, but now it felt like everyone had turned away from her. She had become the invisible one again. It was a strange contradiction, being so obviously dismissed yet so clearly watched. She opened her eyes and turned to the aisle. Stacy was now serving dinner trays. The smell of roasted chicken and wine drifted down the rows. The man behind Danica was laughing again. His tray came out polished, cloth napkin folded with care, silver cutlery arranged perfectly. Stacy placed his meal down with a smile. Bon appetit, Mr. Whitford. Then she turned to Danica's row. No smile this time. No name, just a tray. She placed it on Danica's table with a dull thud. It wasn't the hot meal others received. No entree, no wine, no warm roll on the side. Just a cold turkey wrap, half wrapped in foil, and a plastic knife. Danica stared at it. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The message had already been delivered. Stacy stepped back, arms crossed lightly over her apron. We ran out of hot meals, she said. This is what's left. Danica looked up, slow and steady. I confirmed my meal last week when I booked the flight. Well, Stacy shrugged. Systems mess up. It happens all the time. She turned and walked away. The cabin air felt heavier now, like it had thickened around Danica's seat. She looked at the tray. The sandwich was crushed slightly on one side. The lettuce had wilted. The cup of water next to it was already sweating on the tray. Danica didn't move. Her breath came in steady draws, each one quieter than the last. Her fingers pressed lightly against her skirt, flattening a small wrinkle that wasn't there before. She could feel the eyes again. Not full stares, but those glances people do when they want to look without getting caught. The kind that make you feel like an exhibit, like people were studying how she would react. She thought of reacting, thought of standing up and calling it what it was. But that wasn't her way. She didn't make scenes in front of strangers. She didn't give people the show they were hoping for. She'd seen too many headlines twist those moments into something else. Passenger lashes out mid-flight. Disruption on board causes tension. No, that wouldn't be her. But her silence wasn't weakness. It never had been. It was choice. And tonight, her silence had weight behind it. Danica slowly closed the tray table without touching the food. She reached for her briefcase and slid it out carefully. Her fingers moved with precision, not rushed, not dramatic, just focused. Inside the case, tucked behind a leather-bound notepad, was a sealed folder marked CRD. She pulled it out, quietly placing it on her lap. The initials stood for Civil Rights Division. It wasn't part of her current case. It was something she kept with her, always. It contained recent updates on federal aviation compliance laws, including one she helped write, one that addressed discriminatory conduct in service industries. She pulled out her pen and started jotting down details. Time of incident: 7:52 p.m. Flight attendant name Stacy Colburn. Seat number 3A. Incident: disparate treatment in cabin service. Evidence: visual, witness, digital record. Her handwriting remained steady. No anger, no flourishes, just facts. A small tremor in her chest started to settle. Her hands were no longer clenched. The storm inside her didn't roar. It sharpened. Her silence wasn't about fear or shame. It was about precision. Because she knew what came next would not be loud, but it would be final. Danica looked up briefly as Stacy passed by again without making eye contact. She didn't need her to. Stacy had already made enough contact, with her tone, with her choices, with her indifference. Danica lifted her phone from the seat pocket and opened a secure messaging app only used by federal attorneys. She typed one line: "In-flight discrimination protocol in motion. CRD alert flagged. Follow-up requested." She didn't hit send just yet. She sat back in her seat looking at the dark window. Her reflection stared back, calm, unreadable. Let the rest of the flight play out. Let Stacy finish her rounds. Let the passengers sip their wine and recline their chairs. No one needed to know just yet. Because Danica Miles didn't need to raise her voice. She just needed to send one message at the right time. The cold tray sat untouched in front of her, its damp plastic wrap curling slightly at the corners. Danica Miles leaned back against the seat, her arms crossed softly, her gaze still fixed on the window, though her mind was far from the sky. She could hear the quiet clinking of cutlery around her, the occasional muffled cough, the low hum of an action movie 2 rows up. Someone laughed at something on their screen. Life went on. Everything felt normal. That was the part that always struck her the hardest. No one said anything. No one asked if she was okay. No one questioned why the only black woman in business class had been served a half-wrapped turkey sandwich when the others were sipping wine over hot entrees. She was used to it. That silence, the kind that doesn't scream hate but sits just heavy enough to push you down a little, wasn't new. She'd walked into courtrooms where junior white attorneys were assumed to be the lead counsel, and she was asked to wait outside. She'd been offered the assistant's seat during a legal panel she was scheduled to speak on. And once, at a private firm's networking event, a partner mistook her for the catering staff. Danica had learned long ago that racism didn't always wear boots and banners. Sometimes it wore aprons and name tags. Sometimes it wore lipstick and a tight bun, and moved down the aisle of an airplane like it owned the space. Her cheek still tingled. Not from a slap, no hand had touched her yet, but from the sting of being deliberately made small in front of others. She rubbed the side of her face gently. Not for comfort, but to remind herself she was still here, still whole, still in control. The seatbelt light flickered on again as the pilot announced light turbulence ahead. Stacy walked briskly down the aisle, now collecting trays and securing the cabin. When she reached Danica's row, she paused for the briefest moment. Her eyes flicked to the untouched sandwich. She gave a half smirk, maybe thinking it was petty, maybe thinking it was beneath her to care. She reached forward without a word, grabbing the tray with one hand, brushing past Danica's folded arms. The cup of water tilted slightly, some of it spilling onto Danica's lap. Danica flinched. Stacy didn't apologize. She didn't even blink. She just turned away and moved to the next row. Danica stared down at the small wet spot spreading across her skirt. The cold sank into her skin. She didn't move right away. She sat still, her hands gripping the armrests now, her nails pressing lightly into the fabric. There were no gasps this time, no awkward glances, just more silence, the kind that makes a person feel like they're watching themselves from the outside, like they're not even real. Her breath tightened for a moment, shallow and slow. She looked straight ahead, not at anyone, not at the curtain separating business from first class, not at the empty glass now dripping onto her tray. She looked at nothing. And in that nothing she felt something shift, not rage, not even pain. Something older, something deeper. Exhaustion, not the kind that sleep could fix, but the kind that comes from years of having to decide, again and again, whether to let it go or stand up, whether to risk being seen as too sensitive or too angry or just making a scene. She thought about her niece, 12 years old, who wanted to be a judge one day. Like Auntie Danica, she had said with pride. What would she think if she saw this? If she saw her aunt reduced to silence by a flight attendant who couldn't even look her in the eye? If she saw the tray of cold food and the water stain on her lap? Danica wiped her hands slowly on a napkin. Then, with care, she reached again for her phone. This time she typed more than one line. Subject: passenger discrimination. Urgent en route. Flight number NX473. Incident type. Service disparity and conduct targeting. Time of incident. Approximately 7:50 to 8:20 p.m. EST. Notes. Repeated microaggressions. Cold meal denied. Water spilled. No apology. Witnesses present. Attendant name, Stacy Colburn. Uniform ID, SC217. Current status, documented. Preparing formal complaint. Next steps, confirm CRD contact on arrival. She attached a photo of the tray before it was taken. She had taken it quietly as Stacy turned to the next row. Just the meal, the seat, the timestamp. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about record, truth, pattern. She saved the draft, didn't send it yet. She needed the right moment. Danica leaned back into her seat again. She folded her arms across her chest, warm now not from rage but from resolve. This wasn't the worst she'd faced, but it might be the last time someone like Stacy Colburn got away with it. Another hour passed. The cabin had grown quieter now, with most passengers either dozing off or scrolling silently through their phones. Overhead lights dimmed to soft blue, and a warm hush settled over the space. But Danica Miles didn't close her eyes. She sat upright, awake, not restless but alert. Her body was still, but her mind was running. She had replayed every moment since boarding, over and over again. The way Stacy had looked past her. The plastic cup, the cold sandwich, the water, the silence, and maybe most of all, the eyes that had watched it all and quickly looked away. That was the hardest part. Not Stacy's tone, not the way her tray was dropped like a leftover, not even the silence from Stacy when the water spilled. It was the absence of anyone who said, "That's not okay." She wasn't surprised. She didn't expect anyone to speak up. Most people on planes were too tired, too polite, too scared of delays or drama. But it always felt like a second slap, the collective silence, the agreement by inaction, that she could be treated differently. Danica knew how people saw her. Middle-aged black woman, traveling alone, briefcase always at her side. Not flashy, not loud. Quiet strength was her armor. But that armor often made others assume she didn't need help, that she didn't feel the sting, that she'd brush it off like always. She looked down at her skirt, the damp patch now nearly dried. She rubbed it gently with a tissue, not because it would help, but because it gave her hands something to do. She thought about calling it in right now, pressing send on the draft she'd written. Her thumb hovered over the button, but something stopped her. Not doubt, not fear, timing. Danica knew better than to go too early. She had learned over the years that justice didn't always come to those who shouted first. It came to those who moved with strategy, with facts, with precision. That's what made her dangerous in court. And that's what would make her dangerous now. She put the phone down. Let it simmer. Across the aisle, she noticed Stacy again. She was back in the galley, laughing softly with another attendant. The tone had changed. Gone was the sharp edge from earlier. Now her face was animated, her body relaxed, as if nothing unusual had happened at all, as if Danica was just another face she could forget after landing. Danica studied her for a moment longer, just watching. She'd seen women like Stacy in depositions, always polite on paper, never used slurs, never raised voices. But underneath the careful customer service training was a pattern: selective kindness, convenience courtesy, the kind that only stretched as far as skin color, accent, or perceived status. She wondered if Stacy even remembered what she'd done. Probably not. That was the cruelty of it. For Stacy, this was just a shift, a bad sandwich, a demanding passenger. Nothing that would stay in her mind after she clocked out. But Danica would remember, because she had no choice. Her job, her life had been built on remembering, on being the one who noticed the little cuts others ignored, on turning those cuts into cases that changed policies, careers, companies. This wouldn't be any different. She reached again into her briefcase and pulled out a second file. This one was slimmer, marked with a silver tab at the corner. Inside were notes on her ongoing work with the Federal Aviation Authority's Civil Conduct Reform Initiative, a program she had helped build quietly over 2 years. The goal was simple: identify, track, and remove bias from cabin crew behavior. Not with lectures or posters, but with real data, real reports, real consequences. Her eyes moved over the notes. She highlighted 2 lines with a yellow marker. Repeat microaggressions by service staff toward minority passengers will trigger automated compliance review. Documented incidents involving physical contact or verbal dismissal will be escalated to Level 3 protocol. She tapped the file closed. This was no longer about the sandwich, or the water, or even Stacy. It was about pattern, about the quiet way systems protected people like Stacy. Not because they meant to, but because they didn't look close enough to care. Danica checked the flight map on the screen in front of her. They were halfway across the country. 90 minutes to landing. That was enough. She opened her phone and sent a secure message, not to the FAA hotline, but directly to Clara Miles, the lead federal compliance officer she had worked with last spring. She typed slowly, each word carefully weighed. Clara, I'm currently on flight NX473. I've documented a clear service disparity incident involving crew member Stacy Colburn. Multiple passengers observed. Physical contact, water spill, during tray removal. No apology or acknowledgement. I'm triggering a Level 3 behavior review under CRI protocol. Will provide documentation upon landing. Recommend temporary flag on crew member pending investigation. D. Miles. She hit send. There, no turning back. Danica placed the phone face down on the tray table. Her heartbeat didn't spike. Her hands didn't shake. This wasn't revenge. This was structure. This was accountability. This was what systems were supposed to be for, but never were, unless someone like her pushed them to work. She adjusted her seat back half an inch and closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to think, to prepare. Because in less than 2 hours, someone would be waiting at that gate who didn't know they'd made the worst mistake of their career 10 minutes into a flight with the wrong woman in seat 3A. The cabin lights flicked back to a soft white glow as the pilot announced the initial descent into Washington, D.C. A few passengers stirred from sleep, stretching and yawning, while others packed up their tablets and tucked in their earbuds. Flight attendants began their final walkthrough, checking trays, upright seats, and luggage compartments. Everything looked calm. From the outside, it was an ordinary flight nearing its end. But Danica Miles was not ready to land. Not yet. Her eyes remained open, fixed on the empty seat across the aisle. She had barely moved in the last 30 minutes, not out of stiffness, but because her body had entered a kind of stillness that came only when her thoughts turned razor sharp. She could hear everything: the soft shuffle of heels, the click of overhead bins, the low murmur of a man asking for a tissue. Every sound sharpened her focus. She had grown up watching her mother navigate hospital corridors where nobody said, "Excuse me," unless she was holding a mop. She had watched her father, a quiet mechanic, get talked down to by men who brought in broken trucks and left with working ones, but never offered eye contact. Danica had carried those scenes like stones in her pockets. She never let them go. She just learned how to walk with their weight. And now, at 45, even with a decorated legal career and 3 federal cases under her belt, she still found herself holding that same silence. The difference was, now she used it like a weapon. She shifted in her seat just slightly as Stacy passed by again. The flight attendant didn't stop, didn't look down, didn't acknowledge the water-spotted skirt, the untouched tray, the silent Cold War playing out between them. Instead, she smiled brightly at a passenger across the aisle, another white businessman, adjusting his blanket for him with a sweet, almost rehearsed voice. Danica studied her again, not with anger, but with quiet analysis. Stacy was good at this, good at performing kindness, good at giving warmth where she chose, but she hadn't yet learned that selective kindness leaves a trace, that in the right hands, it becomes measurable, provable, actionable. And Danica's hands were always steady. She reached down and opened her briefcase one last time. From a side zipper, she pulled out a small black flash drive. A backup, always kept on her. It contained her current research and legal notes on cabin conduct cases. She hadn't meant to bring it on this trip. But now she was grateful she did. Because this wasn't just about Stacy anymore. It wasn't even about this single flight. It was about a pattern of how women like her, black, accomplished, quiet, and unassuming, were still treated like anomalies in spaces they had every right to occupy. She had done everything right. Polite tone, calm responses, zero confrontation. She had even tried to shield Stacy from her own ignorance, until Stacy chose to make it public. And that, Danica had decided, was the difference between an accident and a violation. She looked out the window again. The city lights were growing larger below, dotted like gold and silver beneath a velvet sky. Home, courtrooms, the firm, the people who called her ma'am and counselor and never dared to assume. She felt the shift of the aircraft nose tilting gently down. They were almost there. Danica opened her phone and saw a new message flash across the top of the screen. Clara Miles, received, flag initiated. CRD system registering compliance event. Forward video or image files if available. We'll have a contact meet you at the gate. Discreet. You'll know them. Danica breathed in deeply. It didn't feel like relief. It felt like confirmation, like standing on the edge of a platform and seeing the train headlights far in the distance. Not here yet, but coming. She pressed the call button, not fast, not loud, just once. Within seconds, Daniel, the other attendant, older with graying hair and careful steps, appeared at her side. His eyes were steady but slightly cautious, like he already sensed something beneath the surface. "Yes, ma'am?" he asked quietly. Danica tilted her head slightly and spoke with the same calm she'd kept the whole flight. "I need the full name and employee ID of your cabin lead for my documentation." Daniel blinked, hesitated a beat, and then nodded once. Understood. He didn't ask why. He didn't push. He simply turned and walked toward the galley. Minutes later, he returned with a small card folded once. No words. Just handed it to her and nodded again. Danica unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, formal. Stacy Colburn, Flight Service Lead, Employee SC217, Crew Assignment, Annex 473, Logged Hours, 1,294 Position, Senior Staff In-Flight Guest Experience Lead. Danica memorized it, then tucked the card into her inner jacket pocket. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She simply said, "Thank you." Daniel lingered for a second too long. His mouth opened slightly, like he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Then he stepped away. The final descent had begun. The plane dipped slightly again. The city lights became crisper, stretching into grids and highways. Danica folded her hands in her lap and watched the ground rise closer. She didn't feel triumph or power. She felt responsibility. Because she knew that somewhere else, on another plane, on another day, there was another woman being handed the same cold sandwich, the same silence, the same shrug. And this time, Danica Miles had decided the pattern would end here. The wheels touched the tarmac with a low groan, followed by the familiar jolt of slowing momentum. A few passengers clapped softly, an odd habit Danica Miles never quite understood. The plane coasted toward the gate, the cabin filling with that nervous, shuffling energy people always seem to carry after long flights. Bags were retrieved from under seats, jackets shrugged back on, neck pillows deflated and tossed aside. But Danica didn't move. She remained seated, back straight, hands calmly folded atop her briefcase. Her eyes stayed focused on the back of the seat in front of her. Every movement around her seemed distant, like a stage play she was no longer part of. There was no sense of urgency in her, no need to hurry. She wasn't rushing to beat the crowd or grab her luggage first. Her mind was still locked in that steady, quiet gear it had shifted into mid-flight, the gear she always used in courtrooms and depositions, the one that let her listen harder, see sharper, and act with weight. The fasten seatbelt sign blinked off. People stood. Bags dropped from the overhead bins. There were murmured goodbyes. A few thank yous called toward the front. Danica remained seated. She wasn't stalling. She was measuring the moment. Something inside her said, wait. Stacy moved down the aisle, all smiles again. Her voice was light now, polite in that customer service tone she'd perfected. Thank you for flying with us, she said to the man across from Danica. She patted a shoulder here, helped someone with a bag there. No hint of tension. No hint that anything unusual had occurred just hours earlier. Danica studied her closely. There was something about Stacy's expression that wasn't fake. It was practiced. The smoothness of someone who had done this too many times, who had been trained to apologize when needed but to smile through it when not. There was no sign on her face that she realized the line she had crossed. No flicker of doubt. No pause in her stride. Just polite detachment. When she reached Danica's row, she paused, but not to say anything. She hesitated, only for a second, as if uncertain whether to speak or walk by. Her lips parted. Danica looked up, not glaring, not cold, just direct. For the first time, Stacy didn't say anything. She kept walking. Danica turned her eyes back toward the front of the plane. Now it was time. The passengers began to move forward, one by one, as the doors opened. A jet bridge connected. The scent of the terminal, a mix of cold air and floor cleaner, filtered faintly through the open door. Danica waited until the last row had cleared before standing. As she stepped into the aisle, Daniel, the quiet older attendant, was near the exit, nodding gently at departing passengers. He glanced at her and gave a respectful dip of the head. She returned it subtly. Then, as she stepped through the aircraft doorway and into the jet bridge, she saw them. Two individuals stood to the right, just past the glass barrier where airport staff usually waited with signs for VIP pickups. But these two weren't holding signs. One wore a dark gray blazer and carried a plain black tablet. The other, a woman in a blue windbreaker, stood calmly with a press badge clipped to her lanyard. They weren't flashy, but Danica recognized the posture, the stillness. Government-trained, compliance officers. The man glanced up and made brief eye contact. Then, without stepping forward or drawing attention, he gave a barely noticeable nod. That was her signal. Danica walked past them without breaking stride. Behind her, she could hear the steps of Stacy approaching. Stacy, still unaware, still humming softly under her breath, still living inside the small bubble of protection that institutions like this had given her for too long. As Danica turned the corner into the terminal, her phone vibrated. Clara Miles. Received confirmation. Stacy Colburn's service credentials flagged. CRD will begin preliminary interview on site. Surveillance data request submitted. FAA liaison has been notified. Thank you. Danica locked her phone. She felt no relief, no satisfaction. What she felt was weight. Not a heavy burden, but the firm pressure of responsibility sitting square on her shoulders, like it always had. She didn't believe in celebrating moments like this, not when the system only reacted after the damage was already done. What mattered now wasn't punishment, it was change. As she stepped onto the moving walkway toward the main terminal, Danica caught a glimpse of herself in the wide glass pane to her left. Same coat, same briefcase, same face that people often ignored until it was too late. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, she wasn't the one who had to explain herself. She wasn't the one who had to prove her worth, justify her presence, or shrink herself to fit someone else's comfort. Tonight, someone else would be asked to explain. And for once, the system was finally going to listen. Danica Miles stepped into the terminal, the low thrum of rolling suitcases and soft announcements echoing off the polished floors. The crowd thinned as passengers peeled off toward baggage claim, restroom signs, and connecting gates. Overhead, fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. Everything looked ordinary. Just another Tuesday evening at Reagan National Airport. But for Danica, the air felt charged. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just full. Like the moment right before a verdict is read. Not because of what she had done, but because of what had been set in motion, quietly, precisely, and with no warning to the one at the center of it. She made her way down the concourse, walking slowly, not because she was tired, but because she wanted to feel every step, to stay present, not to rush through it. After all, moments like this were rare, not in terms of injustice, but in terms of accountability. She'd spent years watching complaints fall through the cracks, watching systems say, "We'll look into it," only to bury the truth under policies, procedures, and polite email templates. But this time, it was different. This time, the timing was right. The documentation was exact. The person in seat 3A wasn't a customer hoping to be heard. She was the one who wrote the framework they'd now have to follow. Danica exited the terminal into the quiet section near the restricted access doors, a side hall where cleaning crews entered and off-duty flight staff slipped through quietly. She knew it well. It was where federal compliance officers preferred to operate, away from the public. Discreet. As she paused near the large glass window overlooking the runway, her phone buzzed again. Clara Miles. Stacy Colburn is being escorted to a private interview room. Crew notified of immediate review. Temporary hold placed on her flight certification pending preliminary findings. Surveillance footage already under retrieval. No action required from you tonight, unless you wish to provide verbal account. Danica exhaled slowly. She wasn't surprised by the speed of it. Clara had always been efficient. But it still caught her off guard. Not the results, but the quietness of it all. How power could move like a whisper when used right. She didn't reply immediately. She leaned slightly against the wall, watching a delayed flight taxi to the gate outside. Stacy wouldn't know until now what was happening. The meeting wouldn't be angry. It wouldn't be loud. It would be clinical. Questions asked gently but firmly. Documentation presented. Surveillance reviewed. Policy violations listed. And at some point in that room, she would realize that the woman she had brushed off during beverage service had the power to suspend her credentials without ever raising her voice. Danica had seen how people reacted in those moments. Some defensive, some tearful, some flat-out confused. But most just stunned. Because people like Stacy often moved through life with a kind of protective fog. A belief that small cruelties didn't count. That politeness, when selective, was still professionalism. That anything not shouted or caught on camera couldn't be serious. But it was serious. And Danica knew that even if Stacy didn't fully understand the impact of her actions, the system would. Still, a small voice inside Danica stirred. One she didn't always admit was there. What if she didn't mean it? That thought crept in, unwanted but familiar. That tug of war she'd been trained to push down, deciding whether to extend understanding or hold the line. Because part of her had spent too many years trying to see the other side. Trying to believe that maybe these were just accidents, oversights, human error. But that part of her was tired now. Not hardened, not bitter, just done waiting for people to figure it out on their own. She pulled out her phone again, tapped a reply. Danica. Let the system proceed without me tonight. She's not mine to teach. She's theirs to answer to. She hit send. She wasn't looking for a confrontation. She wasn't hoping for an apology. She didn't need to sit across from Stacy and explain why what happened mattered. That lesson wasn't hers to deliver. It was the system's turn now. Danica glanced up at the overhead monitor. Her luggage carousel number had been updated. She turned and walked calmly toward the escalator, her heels clicking lightly against the floor. No rush, no detour. Behind her, somewhere in a closed room near the crew operations office, a woman was beginning to understand what it meant to be held accountable by someone who never once raised her voice. And in that quiet realization, justice had already started. The escalator hummed beneath Danica Miles's feet as she descended toward baggage claim, each step rolling into the next like the slow, even beat of a metronome. Her hand rested lightly on the rubber rail, though she didn't need the balance. Her body moved on autopilot now, guided by memory, habit, and something deeper, discipline. A way of moving through spaces where she had often been the only one like her. spaces that had never been built with her in mind. She could feel the fatigue settling into her shoulders now, the long day finally weighing in. It wasn't the kind of exhaustion that sleep fixed. It was the kind that seeped in after you kept your posture straight for hours, after you stayed composed, measured, careful, while being ignored, dismissed, or quietly humiliated in front of strangers. Her mind drifted back to that moment again. Stacy's voice, flat and careless, telling her there were no meals left. The way she had reached for the tray without apology, brushing water onto Danica's lap like it didn't matter. The smirk, the shrug. Danica clenched her jaw for a second, then released it. She wasn't angry. At least, not in the way people thought anger worked. She didn't want to yell. She didn't want to confront. She didn't even want revenge. What she wanted, what she always wanted, was acknowledgement. Recognition that the wound wasn't imagined, that the disrespect wasn't an accident, that the slight wasn't invisible just because it was quiet. As she reached the bottom of the escalator, the carousel came into view, already turning, suitcases tumbling onto the belt in slow rhythm. She moved through the sparse crowd, ignoring the overhead speakers calling out flight numbers. Her suitcase, black and scuffed at the corners, emerged a few moments later. She pulled it off the belt with a single motion, her grip tight on the handle. Danica stood there for a moment, holding the suitcase beside her, unmoving. She thought of the girl from her law school class, Emily Hastings, blonde, confident, breezing through lectures and clerkships with a confidence Danica had always admired and resented. Emily once told her during a group project, "You're so calm all the time, it's like nothing gets to you." Danica had smiled, tight-lipped, and said, "It's not that nothing gets to me. I just can't afford to show it." Emily had laughed like it was a joke, but it wasn't. And this flight was proof of that. If Danica had reacted, stood up, raised her voice, demanded equal service, she knew exactly what would have followed. Raised eyebrows, whispers, maybe a write-up for disruptive behavior. Maybe worse. That's why she didn't respond in the moment. That's why she let the silence speak for her. Because silence, paired with precision, was powerful. She pulled her suitcase behind her, the wheels clacking softly against the tile as she headed for the exit. Just as she passed the double glass doors that led to ground transportation, her phone vibrated once more. Clara Miles. Initial interview complete. Crew member showed lack of awareness, no remorse. Footage confirms event. FAA Regional Lead requests your formal summary tomorrow. Recommendation for immediate disciplinary action underway. You were right to report it. Danica stopped just outside the doors, under the awning where cold night air slipped in through the concrete archway. She read the message twice, then tucked her phone away without replying. Right to report it. The phrase didn't land the way Clara meant it to. Danica didn't need affirmation. She didn't need a pat on the back. What she needed was for people to stop making it necessary. To stop putting her and women like her in the position of having to decide whether to protect their dignity or maintain the peace. She walked outside. A line of black cars idled near the curb, their headlights shining through the mist of the evening. She spotted her ride, a dark sedan with government plates, standard for federal affiliates. The driver stepped out, nodded respectfully, and opened the rear door without a word. Danica climbed in, setting her bag beside her. The leather seat was warm. The door shut with a soft click, sealing her off from the airport noise. The car pulled away from the curb. As the terminal lights faded behind her, she allowed herself a moment, a brief, quiet moment, to breathe. She thought of all the other women who had sat through flights like this, unsure if what they experienced was enough to speak on. She thought of the quiet ones, the tired ones, the ones who swallowed every slight because they didn't want to be that kind of passenger. And she thought of Stacy. She wondered briefly if tonight would stay with her, if, in the weeks to come, she'd remember Danica's face, the silence, the stillness. The moment she realized she'd misjudged the one person on that flight with the power to take everything apart. Maybe. Maybe not. Danica didn't care either way, because the point was never whether Stacy would remember her. The point was that she'd never do it again, not to anyone. The car moved quietly through the night, the city lights stretching out ahead like scattered stars. Danica leaned back, loosened her shoulders, and closed her eyes, not to rest but to reset. Tomorrow, there would be paperwork. There would be a formal statement, a review committee. She'd be called ma'am and thanked and asked for advice on reform. But tonight, there was only the road, and the soft, steady knowledge that she had done exactly what needed to be done, without raising her voice, without demanding attention, without ever stepping outside her place, because she never had to. She knew the power of her place, and this time the world did too. The car slipped through the city's quiet grid, its engine humming low beneath the sounds of rain starting to tap against the windshield. Danica Miles kept her eyes closed, but her mind didn't rest. Each streetlight that flickered across her face reminded her of a courtroom lamp, each pause in the driver's turn like the silence between testimony and verdict. She wasn't playing the night back to relive it. She was reviewing it like evidence, not for personal closure, but for the way her brain had been trained. Facts, reactions, missed cues, body language, voice inflection, all of it. She remembered how Stacy Colburn didn't flinch when the sandwich tray dropped onto her table, how she never looked at her properly, not once, not like a person, more like a task to be checked off. Danica had seen that same energy in boardrooms, elevators, and even during jury selection. It wasn't new, just quieter now, sharper, worn down to something professional and palatable. But racism didn't have to shout anymore. It just needed a uniform and an internal smile code. Danica opened her eyes. They were crossing the Memorial Bridge now. The Potomac glistened beneath the car like ink, stretching dark and reflective beneath the city lights. On the far side stood the Capitol dome, lit and silent, like a reminder of how close she was to the center of the machine that had ignored voices like hers for decades. She pulled her phone from her coat pocket again and opened the CRD case log. The report number had been generated automatically. Report number CRD-DC-4729-1A, there it was. A digital marker that something happened. A marker that someone believed her. That someone would now have to answer. Not with excuses, not with a form letter, but with policy. That's what she fought for. Not feelings, not revenge, not public outcry. Policy. The cold, dry process that institutions only respected when it was too clean to ignore. She reviewed the draft of her formal summary. Attached photo, time logs, crew names. Witness list optional. No emotional language, just bullet points. Just truth. Danica added a final sentence. Note: I did not seek out confrontation. This was not emotional escalation. This was repeated professional disregard. And I responded with professional escalation. She hit save, not send. Not yet. The system was already in motion. Across the seat from her, her briefcase leaned quietly. It had seen years of battles, each one different but always with the same undertone. A woman like her, in a room like that, being seen too late and too little. She thought of the countless legal conferences where she was mistaken for a paralegal, of the taxi drivers who asked her if she was traveling for family stuff, of the airline lounges where she was double-checked, even with her membership badge on display. It always came back to this. People never imagined that someone like her had built the walls they were leaning on. Not until the walls started moving. The car eased into her neighborhood. Quiet, brick-lined, with old trees and porch lights left on out of habit. Her building was modest but clean, a row house converted into 3 flats. The kind of place where no one asked questions, and everyone nodded hello without needing names. The driver pulled to a smooth stop at the curb. She gathered her things slowly, deliberately. No rush, no need. As she stepped out into the cool mist, her coat collar caught the edge of a breeze and lifted slightly. The air felt clear, still heavy, but honest. The driver nodded at her again. "Take care, ma'am," he said. Danica nodded back. "You too." She walked up the steps, key already in hand. The front door creaked softly as she stepped inside. her heels echoing on the old wood floor. She dropped her bag gently, peeled off her coat, and set her phone on the kitchen counter. The apartment was dim, quiet, exactly how she liked it after a long day. She filled a glass of water and stood by the window, looking out over the street. No sirens, no noise. Just the kind of peace that came not from the world being just, but from knowing she had done something to make it a little less unjust. She didn't feel proud. She felt aligned. Tomorrow would be paperwork. Maybe a phone call. Maybe someone would ask her to speak on a panel again. Maybe someone would mention her in a newsletter. But tonight, Danica Miles stood in her own home, in the soft glow of her kitchen light. Not as a victim, not as a hero. Just as a woman who refused to let her dignity be optional. And she knew without doubt that from this day on, Seat 3A would mean something very different to the airline that let someone like Stacy Colburn fly unchecked. It would mean accountability, written in silence, signed in policy, and sealed with action. Morning light crept in through the narrow slats of Danica Miles' blinds, casting thin golden lines across the hardwood floor. She sat at her dining table, hair pulled back, still in a cotton robe, a mug of black coffee cooling beside her laptop. The screen glowed softly, displaying the open case file. Her fingers hovered above the keys, still, as if the act of writing today carried more weight than usual. She wasn't tired exactly, but there was a kind of heaviness in her chest that hadn't lifted overnight. Not sadness, not regret. Just the familiar weight of being responsible for starting something. The truth was, she hadn't planned on becoming part of this conversation again. She'd spent the last 2 years focusing on policy, not people, systems, not confrontations. Her work had shifted from courtrooms to legislative offices. She preferred that distance. It let her focus without constantly having to relive the very bias she fought to dismantle. But yesterday had made it personal again, and when discrimination gets personal, even in its most polite form, it always leaves something behind. A residue. Danica exhaled and finally began to type. Formal statement for CRD file number CRD-DC-4729-1A. On May 12th, I boarded flight NX473 to Washington, D.C. as a fully ticketed business class passenger. I received service that was visibly unequal compared to those around me. Cold meal served without options. Tray removed with spill and no apology. Multiple verbal exchanges with flight lead Stacy Colburn that were dismissive, condescending, and conducted publicly. This was not an isolated incident. It fits a repeated, documented pattern of selective treatment within luxury service spaces. I have filed this complaint not because the meal mattered, but because the message behind the service did. Disparities in tone, attention, and basic respect communicate something more powerful than any policy manual. They tell people who belongs and who does not. And in this instance, I was clearly told I did not. I am submitting this as both a federal consultant to CRD and a private citizen who had every right to be treated equally. She paused. That last line, it struck something inside her, a part she usually kept tucked away, protected under years of discipline and detachment. She added one more sentence. There is no excuse for policies that remain neutral while people do harm in uniform. Danica saved the document and attached it to the CRD portal. She watched the status bar slowly complete its upload, like watching a weight shift from her shoulders into the hands of something larger, something official. Her phone buzzed a minute later. Clara Miles. Received. We're using this submission to begin formal review on CRD Service Bias Watch List 2. Your report will activate long-term monitoring across 15 major airlines under current audit. I'll keep you informed. Danica leaned back in her chair, coffee untouched. She closed her laptop and stared at the morning light streaking across her living room floor. 15 airlines. She hadn't expected that. She'd wanted an internal review, maybe a policy slap on the wrist. But now the scope was widening, and part of her couldn't help but feel a deeper shift happening. That was the thing about bias. It rarely looked like shouting or slurs anymore. It looked like narrowed eyes, like forgotten meal confirmations, like passengers addressed by seat numbers while others got names and smiles. And because it looked so small, so polite, it kept getting ignored. Until someone in 3A decided to write it down. She stood slowly, stretched, and moved to the window. Her block was waking up. Neighbors walking dogs, kids in uniforms waiting for the school bus. Somewhere down the street, a delivery truck idled with its hazard lights blinking. Life went on. But something in the system had changed. Quietly, permanently. And for once, Danica didn't have to push to be heard. She had written it once. Clean, clear, professional. And that was all it took to shake something loose. She turned away from the window, went back to her coffee, and finally took a long sip. It was bitter. But this time, it tasted like progress. The next few days passed with a stillness that felt deceptive. Danica Miles returned to her routine, early mornings, office meetings, reviewing policy drafts, answering quiet phone calls from colleagues who used words like commendable and important, with the same dry politeness that Stacy Colburn had used during the flight. No one said her name publicly, but she knew. Behind the closed doors of CRD meetings and legal departments, she had become a reference point again. A case study. See what happened on NX 473? Yeah, that was her. Danica had been here before. The woman who sat through the thing, who said nothing when it happened, who filed it all after. Neat, legal, clean. But she also knew what happened next. The quiet part. The emails that don't get returned as fast. The changed tone in rooms where people wonder whether you're going to bring up race stuff again. The polite distance that forms like frost between professionals who used to feel comfortable around you. She wasn't naive. Change had a cost, even when it was right. By Thursday afternoon, she found herself seated in a conference room at the Department of Transportation, waiting to review updated language on luxury air travel equity laws. The meeting was procedural, almost boring. Fluorescent lights overhead, a ticking wall clock, the tap of pens on notepads. Danica sat at the end of the table, watching the others present. All suits. Mostly white. Mostly men. None of them had been on flight NX 473. But they had all read her report. She could feel it in the way they spoke. Too careful. Too respectful. When it was her turn to speak, she didn't touch the binder in front of her. She just looked at them evenly and said, "The problem isn't that airlines don't have policies. It's that no one enforces them until someone like me documents it, line by line." A few heads nodded. Someone cleared his throat. She continued, voice steady. "This isn't about bad service. It's about the choices people make when they think no one powerful is watching. That's when systems show you what they really are." No one responded for a beat. Then a man 2 seats over, Deputy Director Harold Teague, spoke up. "Well, Ms. Miles, your report has put quite a spotlight on something we've known was there but couldn't quite quantify. It's being used now in the internal recommendation to escalate bias monitoring to Tier 2 enforcement. That's no small thing." Danica didn't smile. Not because she wasn't pleased, but because she couldn't afford to look satisfied just yet. She simply nodded. "Then let's make sure it sticks." The meeting moved on. Words filled the room again. Phrases like standardized training, bias analytics, real-time cabin feedback systems. But under all of it, she felt something else. Shift. Not loud. Not dramatic. But real. Later, as she exited the building and stepped onto the sidewalk, the spring air met her skin, cool but not harsh. She wrapped her coat tighter and walked toward the metro. Her pace wasn't rushed, but it was firm, controlled. Midway down the block, her phone buzzed. A text. From someone she hadn't heard from in years. Ava Redmond, FAA Counsel. "I just read the report. You did what most people talk about but never follow through on. Just wanted to say thank you. That took more than professionalism. It took nerve." Danica stopped walking. She stared at the screen for a long moment. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard. Then, slowly, she typed her reply. "I didn't do it to be thanked. I did it because I knew what would happen if I didn't. She hit send, slid the phone into her pocket, and kept walking. Cars passed. Lights changed. Somewhere far behind her, maybe in a conference room she'd never visit, someone was rewriting a section of policy she had forced them to confront. And that was enough. Danica didn't need a headline. She didn't need her name in a press release. She had her silence, her clarity, and the knowledge that the system had moved because of her. Seat 3A had spoken, and this time the system didn't look away. The following week, Danica Miles sat alone on a bench in the atrium of the Civil Rights Oversight Committee building. It was quiet there, tall glass windows pouring in natural light, the soft rustle of papers from a clerk somewhere nearby. Outside, cherry blossoms were starting to fall, drifting across the plaza like pieces of ash. She watched them with calm eyes, but her mind wasn't on the petals. She was waiting, not for a decision. That part had already been made. Stacy Colburn's flight credentials had been suspended for 90 days pending mandatory equity training and a formal internal review. The airline issued a private apology. Not public. Not yet. But word was spreading. Within CRD channels, the incident had become what they called a precedent flag, a live example used in training seminars, in case law prep, in the hands of people who might never know Danica's name, but who would repeat the story of Flight NX473. That alone should have been enough. But today, Danica wasn't there to follow up on the case. She was there for a meeting she hadn't expected, requested quietly by a mid-level supervisor from the same airline, someone named Rebecca Ames, who had reached out through a private message 2 days earlier. The message had been brief. "I manage oversight for onboard service teams. I've reviewed your case. I'd like to speak if you're willing, not for defense, for understanding." Danica didn't respond at first. She let it sit. She wasn't sure what a conversation like that would even mean, but something about the tone, the humility in it, made her pause. And so, now, she was waiting. The atrium door creaked open. Rebecca walked in, early 40s, plain gray suit, no makeup, her face drawn but composed. She looked like someone who had sat through too many long meetings lately. She held a slim folder under her arm and a quiet urgency in her eyes. Danica stood, gave a small nod. They didn't shake hands. They sat opposite each other at the edge of the bench, an awkward silence filling the space between them before Rebecca finally spoke. "I've read every word," she said, voice low. "The report, the footage, the transcripts. I just didn't know how much of this was still happening on my watch." Danica didn't answer right away. She studied the woman's posture, not defensive, not performative, just tired, like someone facing the mirror a little too late. Rebecca glanced down at the folder in her lap. "Stacy, she's not new. She passed all our training modules, scored high in performance reviews, never had a formal complaint stick." Danica tilted her head slightly. "That's exactly the problem, isn't it?" Rebecca looked up, eyes meeting hers. "Yeah," she said quietly. "It is." For a moment they sat there in silence again, both women watching people move through the lobby, young attorneys, policy interns, assistants holding paper cups of coffee and clutching phone chargers. "Why did you really ask to meet me?" Danica asked softly. Not accusing, just direct. Rebecca hesitated. "Because we're rewriting our in-flight bias training module. And your name, it keeps coming up. Quietly. Off record, people are nervous. Some think we're overcorrecting, some think we're doing too little. But everyone agrees. Something cracked open after your report." Danica folded her hands in her lap. "And what do you think?" Rebecca took a deep breath. "I think we need someone who knows what it feels like to be looked at last, spoken to last, served last. I think we need that perspective written into the foundation, not tacked on the side." Another pause. Then Rebecca extended the folder toward her. "Consulting offer," she said. "Formality, I know. But it's more than that. I want you in the room when we build this from the ground up. Not just as a case file. As a voice, Danica didn't reach for the folder right away. She looked at it, then at the woman holding it. "Why me?" she asked again, quieter this time. Rebecca's voice didn't crack, it didn't tremble, but it carried weight. "Because you didn't yell, you didn't record a video, you didn't storm the cabin or post about it online. You just made the system move and it couldn't stop once it started." Danica felt something shift behind her ribs. Not pride, something smaller, something closer to acknowledgement. A feeling she rarely allowed herself to sit with. She took the folder gently. Not as a favor, but as a contract, as proof that change, when done right, starts not with noise, but with nerve. And she had plenty left. 3 months later, Danica Miles walked down a quiet corridor in a high-rise overlooking the Potomac, a slim leather portfolio tucked beneath her arm. Her heels clicked gently against the polished stone floors, each step even, unrushed, deliberate. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't unsure. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. To her right, a brass plate read, "National Aviation Ethics and Training Center, Room 408, Equity and Service Standards Working Group." Inside, a dozen people were already seated. Legal counsel, diversity officers, senior airline executives, and 2 federal compliance directors. On the wall behind them, a large screen displayed the title of the day's session, "Redesigning Respect, Equity Enforcement in Cabin Culture." They looked up as Danica entered. No one whispered. No one second-guessed. She was no longer just the woman in seat 3A. She was now the author of the change they had been forced to reckon with. Rebecca Ames, seated near the front, stood and gestured to the empty chair beside her. Danica walked to it without hesitation, sat, and opened her folder. Inside were draft outlines, proposed revisions, and one document that bore her name at the bottom. A framework she had built from scratch over the last 8 weeks. Not policy written in theory, policy written in experience. She didn't speak first. She waited as the session opened. As one executive shared vague updates, another rattled off metrics. When it was her turn, she didn't raise her voice or lean forward to dramatize her presence. She simply said, "You can train people to pour wine correctly, to fold napkins neatly, to remember passenger preferences. But if you're not training them to see every passenger as human first, you've failed before takeoff." Silence followed, not in resistance, but in respect. She continued, "What happened on NX 473 wasn't about a cold sandwich. It was about something much colder. It was about the ways dignity is withheld in small, subtle gestures, and how easy it is to ignore that, until someone documents it in ink." She let the words sit in the room. Then she handed out copies of her revised service ethics policy. No dramatic finish, no applause, just quiet hands taking pages, pens beginning to move, heads beginning to nod. By the time the meeting ended, no one looked at her as a case file anymore. They looked at her as a force. Outside, the afternoon sun lit the skyline in soft gold. Danica stepped into the light, portfolio under her arm, the weight of the past 3 months settling into something calm. Not closure, not satisfaction, but a kind of peace. Because this time, when the plane landed, she didn't just exit the story, she rewrote the landing. And the next time someone like Stacy Colburn thinks about who's in seat 3A, they'll remember the woman who never raised her voice, but still made the whole system listen. If this story moved you, please give it a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this one.